you. Obrigado, obrigada. Como é óbvio, eu now falo português. And so to spare us all a great deal of pain, I will speak in English. But if you, and like Allan, I would very much like it if people ask questions when we came to the point they wanted to ask the question about, because if we wait to the end, people only remember the end. And so it's better if we go along. Okay. Let me say first what a pleasure it is to be here. I had never been to Brazil before last week, and I didn't even spell it properly. See, and I've just been enchanted with the country. I think it's extraordinary. Okay, let me say a little bit about this talk too. For about the past year, I've been working on and off on a paper that's supposed to appear in a book of papers of history of the theory of truth. And so when I was asked to give a title or a topic for this, I thought, I'll talk about something from that paper. And listening over the last few days to what people are interested in, I came to think maybe I should focus on the very first part of medieval theories of truth. And so today I'm going to talk about Augustine and maybe Anselm, and if there's lots and lots of time, which there won't be, I'll perhaps get to some of the 12th century people. But there is a longer work, and if anyone would like it or would like to talk about truth or about anything else, there's my email address, and I'd be very glad to communicate with people. Okay, the paper begins with an allusion to an illusion. Okay, there's a paper by J.L. Austin on truth, which begins, "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and did not stay for an answer. Pilate was ahead of his time. Now it turns out that Austin is in fact quoting Francis Bacon, who, here's the opening of Francis Bacon on truth. "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. But Pilate was not only ahead of his time, perhaps, but very much out of his time, because discussions of truth were a major feature of late ancient philosophy. And the discussion of truth continued well into the Middle Ages, and indeed, as we see just from the fact that Bacon himself wrote on truth, and so did Herbert of Cherbury and lots of other people, it's really never fallen out of fashion. So Pilate was certainly not ahead of his time in any ordinary way. Now, let me just set the stage a little bit by talking about about the background to medieval discussions of truth. There are several places from which medieval theorists got their accounts of truth. Some of them came directly from Aristotle. Aristotle's work was mostly forgotten in the period from soon after his own death until really the end of the 2nd century of the Christian era. But after that, it became more and more important. And by the end of antiquity, Aristotle was a major philosophical figure, so that a great deal of his work was translated into Arabic, and perhaps largely through the prestige that it gained in late antiquity and in the Arabic world. It was translated in the late 12th and early 13th centuries into Latin. But some texts of Aristotle were translated into Latin quite early in the 5th and 6th centuries, the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th centuries, and remained a staple of the curriculum throughout the medieval period. And in particular, the categories and the De Interpretatione really did. The De Interpretatione didn't have quite the uninterrupted study that the categories had, but very nearly so. Now, when Aristotle turns in the categories and the De Interpretatione to discuss truth, he there is really talking mostly, it seems, about the truth of certain kinds of complex items, in particular sentences and states of the soul. Aristotle doesn't have a propositional or sentential logic. It's not even clear that he's got the concept of a complex proposition. His concern is with asserted simple sentences. And he takes most of them to be either true or false. But there's a famous discussion in De Interpretatione, chapter 9 of book 1, and a related discussion in Metaphysics 6.3, which they did not have in the early Middle Ages, about whether or not certain sentences about the future might not have a truth value. Right? Exactly which sentences is an interesting question. Singular sentences, maybe not just singular sentences, a little bit complex. So one issue that might come up when you're thinking about a theory of truth is which sentences would have truth values. But another issue that might come up is what, in fact, are the items that could have truth values. As I've said already, Aristotle in the categories and the De Interpretatione focuses, it seems, on sentences and states of the soul, but there's really some reason to suggest that he thinks of those as derivative truth bearers, derivative upon a more basic kind of item, which might be complex in a certain way. Let me see if I can get this to there. So you might ask, for example, what makes a sentence like Socrates exists to be true? And you might think, it's Socrates. Or what makes a sentence like Socrates is pale to be true? And you might think it's a complex item, pale Socrates, an accidental unity of some kind. And you might wonder, is pale Socrates a thing? Right? It seems straightforward to think that Socrates is a thing, but what about pale Socrates? Okay, so one issue that a theory of truth has to deal with is what are the bearers of truth? What are the kinds of things of which one can say correctly that they're true or false, or that they lack a truth value, but in some sense that's a surprise. And a second question that one might ask, of course, is what it is for something to be true. Now, Aristotle was not the only source through which worries about truth came into the Middle Ages. One source that has not been properly explored, I think, is the Stoic tradition. There's much more Stoicism in the Middle Ages than people give credit for. And if you look at Stoic theories of truth, you find something quite interesting, I think. The Stoics distinguished between the true, to aletheis, and truth, aletheia. Now, the items of which you can say that they're true are what they call axiomata, and axiomata in their picture are, well, they call them lecta. They're things which in English it's hard to translate, but people often say assayable, something of which one can say, right? And complete lecta, which are the ones that are the axiomata, are what are said by sentences. And in English, they're picked out by that clauses. In Latin, they're picked out by accusative infinitive constructions, as well as quad clauses, quem clauses, and so on. So that's true. But truth for the Stoics is quite another matter. The Stoics are materialists in an interesting sense. That is, they think that everything that really exists is material, though there's plenty that doesn't exist that they want to talk about. And truth, they think, is something that exists. It's a particular body. Now, there's some controversy among scholars about which body the Stoics think truth is. Some seem to think that it's the body of a particular sage, someone who's wise in the relevant way. I think it's more likely that they think there's a single truth and that it's the body, that it's the rational principle in the universe as a whole. But notice it's an object. It's a thing. It's a singular thing. Okay. And the Stoics quite commonly referred to the rational principle in the universe as a whole as Zeus or God, hotheos, and they would claim, and did claim, that for a sage, for example, to know, which is the only a sage could know, properly speaking for them, would be to be in a particular state, and the state is one in which the sage understands how everything the sage takes to be true is connected with everything else the sage takes to be true. So there's some kind of completeness of understanding, which is what's required for for proper knowledge. Now, what I want to stress here is that one could perhaps suggest that for the Stoics, to know, which is to have this idea of how everything you believe, well, believe is not the right word, how everything you're prepared to assert, let's say, is connected with everything else that you're prepared to assert, is to be in contact with God, right? With his Zeus, with the rational principle of the universe. And if the identification I just suggested is right, that is to be in contact with truth. So the true gets its role from its being a part of truth, right? It's part. Okay, now, although there's no historical connection that I know about, anyway, maybe somebody does. This fits very well with the claim in John's Christian gospel that Christ, whom John there describes as the Theos Logos, right, the Word of God, said of himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And so we have two interconnected terrains, if you like, in which issues about truth and the truth, or the true and the truth, could arise. The first would focus on semantics and suggest that what we have to settle are the questions about which things are true and false. But the second would, in a way, focus on ontology and focus instead on the question of what it is to be true or false, right? What is. So the combination of these two, the semantic issue about the bearers of truth and the ontological issue about what truth is, can be phrased using the very distinction between the abstract and concrete terms that the Stoics employ, right? How could it be that Christ is truth, veritas, and a sentence is something true, verum, right? Now, let me just digress for a moment and say something about truth. In the longer paper of which this is a fragment still under construction, I've been rewriting it a lot in the last few days, I conclude that there must be at least three subjects that need to be talked about. One is what I'm calling here the ontology of truth. What is truth? A second is this issue of the truth bearers, which items can be said to be true, and in particular, what about future contingent sentences, which can they be said to be true as well? And the third, interestingly, is issues about self-reference and the liar paradox. The self-referential paradox is connected with sentences like, this sentence is false. These turn out to be quite interestingly connected with one another. Today, I just want to focus on the ontological issues about truth. And I'll leave the stuff about future contingents and the liar paradox aside, though we'll see it may come up very briefly towards the end. But again, if people would like to talk about either of the others, I'd be happy to. Now, although the identification of Christ with truth is a significant theme in Christian scripture, it seems to me, anyway, and I don't know the patristic literature well enough to say this with much confidence, that it's Augustine who begins to develop it in a systematic manner. And I think I take the key idea to be already in his soliloquies, Book 1, Chapter 3, where he addresses God this way. He says, I invoke you, God, truth, in whom and from whom and through whom are true all of those things which are true. I think that I'm trying very hard to not say truth more than I need to. Now, in Soliloquies 2:2, he borrows, but he significantly extends a topos from earlier discussions of skepticism to argue that there cannot fail to be truth, because even if there were no other truth, there would be the truth that there is no other truth. Now this is an interesting idea. It's not new to Augustine. It comes. It's in Sextus Empiricus, and but Augustine develops it in a more acute way, I think, than you find it in Sextus. So that's one thing that Augustine does. And then in De Libero Arbitrio, he argues for the existence of God in his dialogue with Evodius, by arguing that while some items, for example, claims about what colors we're seeing, are true and depend on us, so that if we sensed or judged differently, they would be different, there are others, and his examples there are mathematical claims and fundamental principles of practical wisdom, which we don't create, but discover, and to which our judgments must conform if they're to be correct. So there's something higher, as he puts it there, and that shows us that there must be something above us. And he argues there that these items are themselves eternally, immutably, and necessarily true. And so, although he doesn't really work this out in much detail, he suggests there that this truth must be identified with God. Okay. Now, let me pause for a moment to examine Augustine's line of reasoning. The passage that I mentioned above, I invoke you, God, truth, and so on, from whom and by whom and in whom, right, everything is true, seems to rely on a special case of what Peter King has called the Platonic principle. I used to call it the realist principle, and then I read this unpublished paper of Peter's in which he called it the Platonic principle, and so I figured Peter got there first. He gets to name it. Okay, so here's the principle. The principle is that if S is P, right, if some subject has some feature, then there is something, a P-ness, through which S is P. Right? So if Helen is beautiful, there's something beauty through which Helen is beautiful, and so on. And Augustine is quite explicit about this in chapter 15 of the Soliloquies. Right? There his example is chastity. He says, chastity differs from a chaste thing, just as truth differs from true, and just as a chaste thing is chaste through chastity and not the other way around, so a true thing is true through truth and not the other way around. Okay. Now, Augustine's very fond of this principle. It's a standard piece of Platonism, and but Augustine really relies heavily on it in a number of places. So with the principle in mind, he approaches the passage that I alluded to earlier in 2:2, where he argues that there necessarily is truth. Maybe by arguing that in some sense, the claim that there isn't truth would be self-refuting. So here's the text. R is for Ratio and A is for Augustine. This is in the soliloquy. Okay, so when it will have perished, if it's going to perish, will it not then be true that the world has perished? For as long as it's not true that the world has perished, it hasn't perished. There's a conflict, therefore, between the world having perished and it not being true that the world has perished. Augustine says, I grant it. And then reason says, does it seem to you that it's possible that something be true while truth does not exist? That's the Platonic principle. No way, says Augustine. Nullo modo. Therefore, there will be truth even if the world were to perish. And that argument is anticipated by Sextus, but it really is worked out in more detail in Augustine. Now, what's important to realize is that this argument depends on more than the Platonic principle. So, it depends on, at least on this principle, which Luca Castagnoli has called the principle of the prefixivity of truth, namely that, or prefixivity, namely that if P, where P is some truth bearer, then it is true that P. Now, this is a very complicated principle. It's one half of what people call the Tarski biconditional, and it's the controversial half. Practically anyone will grant that if P is true, P, but whether or not you can move from P to P is true, whatever P is much more controversial. The liar paradox, in particular, looks like a case where you cannot do this. Why? Well, because consider the sentence, this sentence is false. Okay? Now, there have been various solutions proposed to what goes on there, but if you admit the argument from this sentence is false to this sentence is false is true, you're almost certain to end up in paradox. So one natural way of attempting to avoid the liar, it's a way that a number of medieval writers take, Jean Buridan, for example, is to deny this principle. Okay, well, so Augustine's argument depends upon the Platonic principle, and it depends upon this prefixivity of truth principle. But even with this principle in place, there's still a problem. And it's a problem that was pointed out later by Duns Scotus in a line of thought that's actually very much developed by John Buridan. And let's just work through this briefly. Okay, the argument asserts that were the world to perish, it would be true that the world had perished. Okay, that's what ratio gets Augustine to agree. But notice that this is not quite the same as it is true that the world would have perished were the world to have perished. Right? B, what I'm calling B here, is true if we grant this principle PT. It asserts that it's true in our current situation of a situation in which the world has perished, that it has perished. That's, I think, true. But A depends on it being true in the situation in which the world has perished, that it has perished. Right. Now, Scotus wants to point out that, let me see, I guess I have to... There's this argument of Scotus's was first noticed, I think, by Charon and Doyle in a paper back in the mid-90s, but it's taken up also by Luca Castagnoli. Here's Castagnoli's translation of the Scotus text from the Ordinatio. And when it's proved that if there is no truth, it's true that there is no truth, this consequence is invalid, because truth can be taken either as the foundation of truth and reality, or as truth in the intellectual act of combining and dividing. But if there is no truth, it's not even true that there is no truth. Neither in virtue of the truth of things, because there's nothing, right, if the world has perished, nor in virtue of the truth in the intellect, which combines and divides, because by hypothesis there's no such intellect either. So the correct consequence, says Scotus, is if there is no truth, then it's not true that there is some truth. But it doesn't follow then it's true that there is no truth. Notice the one that Scotus claims is okay is a negative claim. If there is no truth, then it's not true that there is some truth. The one he's claiming is not okay is an affirmative claim, right? That it's true that that it is true that there is no truth. So, all right. Now I can say more about that if anyone is interested, and you could stop me here and do so, or I can go on. All right, I'll go on. but you can stop me anytime. Okay. The point I want to make, though, is that whatever we make of Augustine's argument, and you can see it's a complicated argument depending upon some very tricky principles, it went, as far as I can tell, unchallenged until, well, here I say until the beginning of the 14th century. But in fact, I think there are challenges to it in a certain sense in Aquinas and some people in the 13th century. When I say in a certain sense, here's what I mean. Augustine is trying to use this argument to conclude that there must be an object which is truth. Aquinas is perfectly prepared to grant that the argument shows you that there must be truth. He's just not prepared to admit that you can conclude on the basis of this argument that there's an object which is truth. The first person I know to have argued that the argument fails even as an argument to the conclusion that there's truth at all is Scotus, so the beginning of the 14th century. Okay, so at least we have to agree that for nearly a millennium it was supposed, it was assumed that to suppose there was no truth was self-refuting. Okay, well, to agree that there must be truth, whether you take it in this kind of general sense that Aquinas is prepared to grant or in the more specific sense that there's an object which is truth, is not yet to agree that there must be only one truth, right? One capital T truth. And there's been some scholarly controversy over how many truths Augustine thinks there are. Because here's a kind of reasoning that somebody might have. Look, truly, S is P in virtue of truth, maybe a truth. Okay, that's the Platonic principle applied to truth, if you like. Well, S is P in virtue of P-ness. That's the Platonic principle applied generally. So, number 3, S is P if and only if truly S is P, and truly S is P in virtue of P-ness. Why? Because S is P in virtue of P-ness, and S is P if and only if truly S is P, so P-ness is enough to guarantee that truly S is P. Okay? And that would suggest that there are as many truths as there are general instances of P, general properties. Now, it's pretty clear that Augustine thinks there's just one truth, and that truth is God, or more properly, the Word of God, right? The second person of the Trinity. Travis Cooper, who is a student of Tim Noon's, who studied this with some care, I think, in his dissertation, has pointed to a passage in Augustine's Enarrationes in Samos, in which Augustine suggests a way of reconciling the view that truth is one, is unitary, with the argument that I've just given, and the view that there are many truths. And here's the passage. It's from his commentary on Psalm 11, it's from Psalm 11, verse 2, and it reads, "For truths, plural, are decayed from among the sons of men." And Augustine's commentary is that truth is one by which holy souls are illuminated, but since there are many souls, many truths can be said to be in them, just as from one face many images appear in mirrors. Okay, so notice now, the move then is to claim truth is one, but there are images of truth in individual knowers or truth tellers, let's say. So there's a sense in which we can speak sometimes of there being many truths. Cooper himself, by the way, concluded that there was just one passage in which you couldn't actually say that this is what was going on. It's Confessions 120. But I myself think that it's the passage in which Augustine says that he was seeking truths, plural, in creatures. I think that's perfectly okay, because at the point where Augustine is, at the time Augustine's talking about there, he didn't think that there was a God who was one truth. And so he could perfectly well have been seeking truths in creatures. So I think there's no good argument to the conclusion that truth is many for Augustine. He seems pretty clearly to think that it's unique. And there are lots of passages in which he identifies it with Christ. So now the question is, does he have an argument for this conclusion? Right? Does Augustine think there's an argument, not just to the conclusion that there must be truth, but to the conclusion there must be one, a unique truth? Well, I think the argument for the existence of God in De Libero Arbitrio that I alluded to earlier might be understood this way. So let me just go quickly through that argument. At the core of the argument lies the idea that A is higher than B if A gets to determine whether B meets A's standards. For example, Augustine writes, just as the internal sense judges the bodily senses when it approves their completeness, so, or demands what is lacking, because the bodily senses themselves judge physical objects, likewise the bodily senses themselves judge physical objects, taking in from their gentle touch and rejecting the opposite. So the idea seems to be, we have our senses tell us whether something is, so to speak, acceptable for us, right? Whether it's too rough or too smooth, that kind of thing. Our inner sense tells us whether our senses, our sight and hearing and so on, are deceiving us because they're out of kilter with one another. And reason, there's something else, Augustine thinks, reason, which can judge even whether the inner sense is operating properly. So having got his interlocutor to accept the principle that that A is higher than B if A gets to settle whether B meets A's standards, Augustine then goes on to ask whether if they can find something eternal and immutable, Evodius will agree that it, or if there's anything else higher than it, that thing is God, and Evodius does. So Augustine then takes us through an argument designed to distinguish between items which are private to us, like our sensations, about which we have first-person authority, and items which are public. The items which are public might still be lower than us, but they're public. They're not things about which we have first-person authority. And finally, after a very considerable amount of discussion, takes up a couple of pages, Augustine and Evodius agree that there are items which meet two conditions. One is they're not private or peculiar to us, they're public. And second is that we don't get to settle how they ought to be. So his examples are numbers and these basic principles of practical reasoning, principles of wisdom. And the thought is, because we have to discover and not determine how these are, and we don't get to settle how they ought to be, we don't get to settle whether it's a good thing that 2 + 2 is 4. Because of that, they must be higher than us, and because they're objective and not like our sensations, something about which we have first-person authority, then we don't each have our own truth with respect to them, right? So the first clause shows that they're higher. The second clause shows that they don't meet this thing that he's mentioned in the Enarrationes in Samos. They're not just reflections of the truth in us. They must be objective, and they must be higher. So there's only one of them. The objectivity guarantees that we all are converging on the same one, and the highness guarantees that it is God. And so there we are. Now I think that's a pretty good argument, given his premises. There's just one lacuna that still bothers me a little bit, and the lacuna is this. Granted that there are objective items, so they're not private, and they're higher than us, how can we be sure there's only one of them? Couldn't it turn out that each mathematical truth has its, so to speak, its own, each mathematical claim that's true, let me be careful here, has its own truth in virtue of which it's so that, what accounts for 2 plus 2 being 4 has nothing much to do with what accounts for 3 plus 3 being 6. Well, I suppose you could go down that road, but philosophers of mathematics typically think, look, the number system is interlocked in a very complicated way, such that it couldn't be that one mathematical principle failed and all the others were true. And I think probably Augustine certainly thought that was so, and so I think he might well be justified in thinking that there's a single source for the being true of all the mathematical and practical claims that are being true. Okay. Now, let me come to my point, though. All that's window dressing. The point is this. One part of Augustine's conception of truth is deeply connected with normativity. A is higher than B if A settles how B ought to be, right? If it's up to A, how B ought to be. And truth is highest because it settles how lower things like minds and physical objects ought to be. So that's one thing. And the second that we've discussed is that truth is unitary, and so Augustine thinks he is in good condition in claiming that it's God. But it's the normativity that I want to stress, right? So, and this, by the way, I think is something where I do disagree with Peter King, because I don't think Peter thinks that this normativity is found in Augustine. But so the thought is, what is characteristic of truth, if you like, on Augustine's picture, what makes it to be the highest thing is that it's in relation to it that other things have to accord themselves. It gets to settle what other things ought to be like. Okay. Now, let me just go on a little bit. Let me just say a couple of things about the bearers of truth. I won't take us through all this stuff. So Augustine, in a number of places, claims that besides sentences and things like sentences being true, also other items are true. For example, trees are true. That's one of his examples. Now, you find this also in Aristotle, right? There's a perfectly good sense of true in Aristotle, where though it occurs only in the metaphysics, not in categories de interpretatione, where Aristotle is happy to say that true is being, or being is true. And this probably goes back to Parmenides, to the whole discussion of the way of truth in Parmenides. So the question then arises, once you've granted that there's a single truth, and once you've granted that it's a normative notion in the sense that that being true is a matter of meeting a standard that's set by truth, then there's still the question, how wide does true how far does true extend? What are the items that are true? And this gets complicated because the traditions that are being reconciled here are themselves very complicated. If you look, for example, in the Perihermeneus of Apuleius of Madura, we find just a very complicated story, which I'll not take us through. Okay, so let me turn back to this issue about truth. I'll gladly talk about true things that are true, if you like, in a moment, if anyone wants. Boethius is a major source for the Middle Ages in discussions of what it is that is true or false. But Boethius is also a major source for another idea, because in Book 3 of the Consolatio, he makes much of the idea that God is goodness, as well as being and unity, and happiness as well, as it turns out. So he spends a good part of Book 3 of the Consolatio trying to show that there's one item, which is being, goodness, unity, and happiness and God. That's really the burden of Book 3 of the Consolatio. He does not talk about truth there. But Anselm takes this on board, and he adds truth to the Boethian list, thus explicitly identifying goodness and truth. Now, if I'm right, we've already seen that there's a normative aspect to Augustine's discussion of truth, but there's no explicit identification that I know of goodness and truth directly in Augustine. But in Anselm, there is. Okay, and he approaches this issue in a number of places, but he starts from his very earliest work, written when he was about 40 years old, the Monologion. And there he follows Augustine both in the view that truth is first and foremost God, and in arguing for the necessity and eternity on the grounds that denying these would be self-refuting. So he accepts the argument from the soliloquies that we spent some time on at the beginning. But in a later work, De Veritate, he develops a theory of this, which goes well beyond, I think, anything we find in Augustine or in his earlier work, or in Anselm's earlier work. De Veritate, Anselm's De Veritate, begins explicitly from a question raised by the identification of God and truth. Right? And here's the question. He says, since we believe God to be truth, and we say truth to be in many other things, I want to know whether, wherever there's said to be truth, we ought to say that it's God. Right? Remember, if Augustine really means that there's one truth and it's God, then wherever you can correctly say there's truth, there you should correctly say there's God. Right? Okay. Okay, now that leads the master and student, it's a dialogue, the De Veritate, on a search for an adequate definition of truth. And by the end of the book, in chapter 13, they do agree that after all, truth is one and that it's God. Okay, but let's see how we get there. Well, at the core of Anselm's theory is the claim that to be true, or to be, now I say here a truth, but I really should have said a true thing, verum, right? Not veritas, but verum. Oh, there we are. Is to have a sort of goodness that Anselm calls rectitudo, a straightness. And in other work in the trilogy of which De Veritate is the first part, Anselm wrote these three things, right? These three works, De Veritate, De Libertate Arbitri, and De Casu Diaboli. And he insisted that they should be read together, that they formed a unity, though exactly why they formed a unity has never been particularly clear to scholars, it seems. But in any case, in other work, he distinguishes two dimensions of goodness. One that he calls happiness or usefulness sometimes, beatitudo, and another that he calls honestum, which I translate as intrinsic worth, and he argues that it's honestum that's really the key. So now his thought is, look, God is goodness, and goodness in this central sense. And God is a standard to which other things have to conform to be right, rectum, or to be true, verum. So then, to be true is to be right or to have a rightness, and that is to conform in the appropriate way to goodness itself, which is God. And so Anselm ends up with the following definition of truth. He says, sorry about that. What have I done here? Here's the following definition of truth. Truth is a rightness perceptible to the mind alone. It's a rectitudo that's perceptible to the mind alone. And he inserts to the mind alone to distinguish the sort of rightness that's at stake from the sort of rightness that in English we still say something like to true a door, for example, which is to get it straight, right? So there's a kind of truing that he wants to distinguish. So this particular truing the rightness that's perceptible to the mind alone is not a truing of a door. Now, although Anselm's central concern is not with the truth of sentences, the whole point of this trilogy is to actually deal with a scriptural passage. And the scriptural passage is where the devil is said not to stand in the truth. Right? It's John 8:44. Okay. So Anselm is really trying to explain this passage. The whole thing is really, I think, trying to explain this passage. How is it that the sin of the devil and the sin of Adam and Eve and so on, on Anselm's picture, amounts to not standing in the truth? Right? Okay, well, and so his idea is that actions can be true or false. And the way that an action is true is by meeting the standard that's appropriate for the action. And the standard that's appropriate for the action turns out to be meeting the standard that God has proposed for the action. Right? So now I say proposed. Anselm doesn't spell out whether this is a matter of God's will or God's nature or anything like that. But the thought is there's this item, truth, which is goodness, and things are true to the extent that they conform to this item. So the particular kind of truth that's truth for an action, we would more naturally think of as a kind of goodness, but it's a conformity to a standard, this ultimate standard. And so with this central idea in hand, Anselm can account for Aristotle's and Boethius' claims about what it is for a sentence to be true, while at the same time he can expand the range of items that might be accounted true to include everything that might be accounted true, right? Because anything of which you can properly say that there's a standard that it's appropriate for it to be assessed with respect to can be described as true. Now, he's perfectly well aware that sentences form a central and special case, and so he devotes a couple of chapters on truth to the way that sentences are related. And you can say a little bit more about that. They're actually very puzzling chapters, and I don't think I fully understand how it works, but I think the thought is, in order for a sentence to be true in a normal sense, it has to meet two standards. One, it has to be formed in such a way as to make claims about the world, and then you can say it's a true sentence. It's truly a sentence. And then the other thing is that given that it's truly a sentence, it has to go on to actually get things right, to actually say things properly. So sentences are a special case, and Anselm knows they're a special case, but he's perfectly happy to call other things true because on his account, anything which you can assess with a standard can be appropriately assessed for truth. Okay, so for Anselm, something is true to the extent that it meets a standard which is ultimately derived from truth, which he's prepared to identify with God. And in the final chapter of De Veritate, the master and the student discuss whether there is a different kind of rectitudo for each kind of truth bearer. So they take up my worry, right, from the last little bit of Augustine. Could it turn out that there's a different kind of truth that's appropriate to each kind of truth bearer? And there, the master argues that there's not, by beginning with the truth of sentences and arguing that a sentence is correct or right, not because the correctness begins to be when what is signified to be is, or when what is not is signified not to be, but because the signification is made in accordance with a rightness that always exists. So what he's claiming is, it's not that sentences become... It's not that a sentence is true or right, because when we form it, we get to settle what's appropriate for what has to be so in order for it to be true. It's rather that what has to be so for it to be true is an objective matter which we can capture or not by the sentences that we make. Right? So notice this is not a speech, in some sense it's not a speech act theory of truth. I don't get to just utter words and Humpty Dumpty like settle what counts for them to be true. The world is however it is, and I can capture or not capture it by what I say, but I can't get to settle the question of whether what I say is what's required to capture the world. And so finally, the master and the student are able to conclude that there's no reason to think that there's more than one rightness, because after all, see, the idea was that if I got to settle by uttering my sentences what counted for them to be true, then there might be, so to speak, a truth for each sentence, a kind of rightness that's appropriate for each sentence. But no. If the world, let me call it that way, settles whether or not what I say is true, then there might be one world. Now, for Anselm, it's not the world, it's God, but nonetheless, there's a single objective item that gets to settle this. And so they conclude the book this way. The student says, I conceded previously that if there's more than one rightness simply because there is more than one thing on which rightness is seen to be, then it necessarily follows that these rightnesses exist and change in accordance with these things. But this was proven not at all to happen. Therefore, it's not the case that there's more than one rightness simply because there's more than one thing in which there is rightness. And then the teacher says, well, do you have any other reason for supposing that there's a plurality of rightnesses? And the student says, just as I recognize that the argument from a plurality of things is faulty, so I see that no other argument can be found, and therefore the rightness of all things is one and the same, and yes, I have to agree. Okay. Now, that, of course, leaves the question why we think that it is one thing for a sentence to be true and quite another for a friend to be true. So Anselm's explanation of that is that just as we incorrectly speak of the time of this event and the time of that event, so we incorrectly speak of the truth of this and the truth of that, whereas the correct thing to say would be to say is that these things are in the truth, not that a friend's being a proper friend is one truth, and 2 + 2 being 4 is another, but rather that they're in the truth. Now, notice that this has the consequence that Anselm is committed to the view that a lot of what we say is false or is at least incorrect. Now, and I won't take you through what comes next, but I will hint at it. So this gets taken up by Robert Grosseteste, because, see, for Anselm, something is true to the extent that it meets a standard that's ultimately derived from God. But Grosseteste actually begins exactly where Anselm leaves off. And he worries about how it could be that so much of what we say then will turn out to be false or incorrect. And he argues that it's not. And here's the form of his argument. It's a long and complicated tale, but let me shorten it this way. Anselm, like Augustine, buys what I've been calling the Platonic principle. And like Plato, both Anselm and Augustine are perfectly happy to say that goodness and truth are univocal notions, so that to say that a friend is true is univocal with saying that a sentence is true. In both cases, what you mean is the appropriate standard is being met. Now, Aristotle had criticized Plato's account of goodness in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, right? On the grounds that what it is that goodness for a human is not the same as goodness for a horse or goodness for some other sort of thing. And that instead, goodness, like being itself, according to Aristotle, is a pros-hen equivocal notion. It operates by analogy. What Grosseteste does is he takes up this same idea with respect to truth. And he argues that truth, too, is a pros-hen equivocal notion, so that what it is for a sentence to be true and for a friend to be true are not the same. But it's but it's not a completely equivocal notion, because both of them get their sense from their relationship to an ultimate notion of truth, which he, like Anselm and Augustine, is perfectly happy to identify with God. So the modification that Grosseteste makes is not to abandon the normativity, but to modify the unity in just the same way that Aristotle modifies the unity of Plato's theory of central forms. Okay, so the picture that I've been trying to paint is a picture in which a certain conception of the ontology of truth develops from Augustine through to Grosseteste. There's much more to be said about it. There's, for example, much more to be said just about the identification of truth and goodness. But I think it forms a kind of coherent picture in and of itself. Now, this may sound a little strange to us, right? We're used to thinking of, we talk about coherence theories of truth, correspondence theories of truth, pragmatic theories of truth, and so on. We're not used to thinking of truth as an object. But remember Father Frege. Right? The true and the false are objects in Frege's semantics. And they have to be objects in Frege's semantics. And indeed, there's a famous argument, right, the slingshot argument, which tries to show that there's a problem in thinking of the true and the false as objects in Frege's semantics. So the problems, in a way, still remains. This picture from Augustine through Anselm through Grosseteste and through much else of the Middle Ages actually wants to maintain that the correct way of thinking about truth is as an object. Pierre Dailly, by the way, towards the end of the 14th century, will modify this to say God is a true proposition. Why? Because every true proposition is mirrored in some way in God. But however you go on that picture, the thought is you have to identify truth not with a relation or a property, but with an object. And it's only if you do that on this way of thinking that you can then give an account of what the relations and the properties in virtue of which things are true are. So let me stop there. Questions? Questions? Yeah.
I think it kind of, I will just move on chronologically to the end of the 13th century, but I've been working with Henry of Milão.
Yeah.
For some time, and it's very interesting the way that he makes this distinction between true and truth, and while he also identifies truth and God and transcendence, he also takes both true and truth and attributes them to the soul as kinds of knowledge. So true is some kind of inferior knowledge when compared to truth, which would be some kind of more developed knowledge. And it's not, in his work, it's not quite clear whether he changed his mind concerning the definition of the knowledge of the truth concerning the thing, or if he did maintain a coherent thought throughout his career. But can you say a little bit what provided him the tools to take this truth, which was considered as an outside thing, and bring it to the soul? Were there antecedents to these movements, or not?
Okay, let me say a word about that. By the way, feel free to ask me questions in French, or I'm sure people will translate if you do it in Portuguese, or even in English. right? This is okay. All right, so let me just say a word. See, already in Grosseteste, who is 50 years before Henry, I guess, on the average, right? You find in his discussion, the one that leads him to the picture I was painting at the very end, you find him discussing a number of different definitions of truth that you find in the tradition. So there's this sort of classical definition: the truth is id quod est. It's which comes from the soliloquies. Id quod est, by the way, is a very interesting expression. You find it also in Boethius's quo modo substantiae as maybe a term for something like an essence. Right? So to say the truth is id quod est would be to say the truth is the very something of something. Okay, so that's one. Now, so here's a definition that comes from Aristotle. Truth is the being in the thing signified as speech has it. Right? So there you're not in the soul exactly, but you're in speech. And now, Grosseteste says, some phrase this definition as the adequation of speech to the thing and of the thing to the intellect. And this, I think, reflects the Latin translation of Avicenna, even though it's usually attributed to Isaac Israeli, because both Aquinas and Albertus Magnus do that, but it's not there. And but it is Avicenna's account. So what I'm guessing is that what happened was that when Avicenna's, in particular, the De Anima, but also the Sufficientiae, those two parts of the Shifa, were translated into Latin, and they had a huge impact. That people began to think, let me back up one more second. So Avicenna is much interested in the question of which things are count as a scientia rationalis. And he is much interested in the question of whether or not you can speak of true states of mind or of the soul rather than of true bits of speech. So my guess is that this idea that that for something to be true is for it to be adequated to the intellect comes from Avicenna, and Henry then would think of it as a perfectly normal part of the tradition for him to deal with. That's my guess.
Because in this situation, what Henry operates in the beginning of Summa is much more sophisticated because he's identifying truth as a state of truth, as an inferior state of mind, state of intellect. Truth is a superior state of the intellect because it connects to the truth, the intellect to the truth, which
is God.
Truth really outside the mind.
Yeah.
God.
So that's actually, I should say, a much more sophisticated picture. So it's a two-stage picture. But true, he's prepared to say, is the state of the intellect itself, right? That's Verum, yeah. Okay.
True. So, I mean, Henry maybe did something much more sophisticated than people usually think he did.
Yeah.
Because he tried to combine, to bring truth to the intellect, to justify the participation of the intellect in the truth outside.
I didn't know that, and it sounds right, and it sounds, Henry is always more sophisticated than people think he is. Even taking that into account. Yeah.
I have a general question, not very specific. This is from Occidental point of view of truth. We have also in India, to take an example of Vedanta.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? Do they have connection with this?
I don't know about the connections. This is a long and complicated business of whether or not there were Indian theorists in Basra and so on. So in Arabic, in the Islamic tradition, Ahak is one of the names of God. It's one of the central names of God. And in Hazali's book on the names of God, it plays a central role. And it's the term that Kindi Kindi uses two terms to apply to God, the one and the true. And that, and Kindi, in fact, who was working at the end of the ninth century, as we think things, about 870, 880, is the first person I know to make truth the center. Well, maybe Augustine too. I've wondered about whether or not there's a source that both Augustine and Kindi might have used. So you find Augustine, if this picture is right, you find Augustine identifying God with truth. You find Kindi also identifying God with truth. Now, whether you can find this in Vedanta or in Buddhist theories, I don't know. I just don't know. There's more to be said about Buddhist logic, where true is used a lot, but truth, abstractly, I don't have any Sanskrit, so I can't say. Yeah.
Perhaps as far as observation, when you were dealing with the role played by sculptors over history, and he being the first that would not accept that there is truth when nothing is. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I'm remembering on Aquinas, on the Veritatis, the first question, I think it's about Article 9, something like that. He evaluates explicitly the situation, the impossible situation where God doesn't exist. And he says that in that case there would be no truth.
No truth. But he still wants to say it would be true to say that God doesn't exist. So there's what he calls truth in common, in communi, but not the truth. Not the truth, but truth in common. Truth in yes, veritas in communi. So that's why I hesitated, because Augustine's argument is an argument that there's an object which is truth, right? And Anselm takes it over. And Grosseteste agrees, even though he wants to say there are more. So when Aquinas comes to evaluate that, the so-called self-refutation argument, he thinks it will not establish that there is an object which is truth. But he's still prepared to accept what this principle PT I had up there, that if God does not exist, it's true that God does not exist. And this becomes a debate. Charon and Doyle, I think, have done some wonderful work there in that 1993 paper, tracing out part of this debate in the 15th and 16th centuries between Scotists and Thomists, Cajetan and Lachetus, for example, because Scotist theorists want to defend Scotus's claim that there would be no affirmative sentences that are true. And the Thomists want to claim, no, the general principle, P, therefore TP, holds. And in fact, this is where there's some interesting issues about the liar paradox, because when some of the Scotist theorists want to argue against that principle, they point to cases like the liar to show that it can't be generally true. And I think they're right. Yes.
Can the same question about truth be asked about falsity?
Well, so in the Fregean framework, the false is an object, right? But there's a general move that Augustine makes and Anselm makes and so on, which is to think of evil, falsity, multiplicity, non-being as absences, right, or as privations rather than as positive states. So if you go down that road, then you'd be inclined to think there's no such thing as falsity. There's just a failure to be true. So to say something is false would be... See, and you could put this nicely within this framework by saying, for something to be true is for it to meet the standard, whatever the standard may be. For something to be false is for it to not meet the standard. Now that's a negative sentence. And a standard way through the later Middle Ages, except in the Thomist tradition, where things were because of this P versus to TP business. A standard way in the later Middle Ages is to think that affirmative sentences have existential import. They require the existence of the things you're talking about. But negative sentences don't. So a negative sentence can be... So things can be as a negative sentence would have it without there being anything at all. So it can be the case that... So if one considers the case where there's nothing, that's not where there is not anything. That's not self-refuting on this picture because it doesn't make any claim about there being something. Whereas if you said, there is nothing, let's suppose, as a noun now, then you would be making an existential claim. And in fact, this comes up in Anselm's treatment of nothing because he's interested in the patristic question of how could God make the world out of nothing. He wants to say he didn't. He did not. He made the world and he did not make it out of anything. Right? So you don't have to suppose there's nothing. You don't have to suppose there's falsity. That's the move. That's one of the nice little asides in De Casu Diaboli. It's the little discussion of nothing. Yeah. No. So look, there's this issue that comes up in the commentary on the posterior analytics of where the starting points of a science come from. And Grosseteste isn't there trying to settle that question. So he doesn't say positively, that the story is the same as he said in De Veritate. But he doesn't deny it either. He just is silent or almost silent on that. Now in De Veritate, I don't think it's obvious that we have a strong theory of illumination. What we have is a picture in which we have a series of metaphors, really, for how truth gets reflected in these other secondary senses of truth. Whether it amounts to a full-blown theory of illumination, I'm uneasy to say. So I'm inclined to think what Stephen's done is he's sharpened the account of knowledge in the De Veritate and and blunted a little bit the account in the commentary, and then it looks like they must be very different. But I'm not so sure they are so different. Yeah.
Just a little general question. What you have been sketching as a Platonic principle, I think.
That's Peter King's phrase.
Just a side question. It seems to be so constructed as being vulnerable to a criticism like the third man argument. Because you need to say that P-ness is P, and then you have this regress. How did these people manage with this claim, with this problem?
Different people did it differently. I mean, you don't have to say that P-ness is P, right? I mean, you don't have to say that beauty is beautiful or that truth is true, right? You can insist, no, truth is truth and beauty is beauty. Yeah. Self-predication.
Self-predication can be avoided.
Yeah. And so people, I think, go different ways on that. And I don't know of any novel idea that you don't also find in the earlier discussions of that in late antiquity. I mean, people are aware of the third man argument once Aristotle's work is available, but they don't seem to be worried very deeply about it. But of course, as I say, once you get to, this is a particular tradition that buys the Platonic principle. It's not everybody, but by any means, right? So, in fact, let me say a word more about that. It is, in a way, what characterizes the realist tradition. So, when in the late 15th and 16th century, people began to talk about the difference between the reales and the nominales, or I think if there's a way to carve out that difference, it's in whether or not you accept that principle. So, and this is true also in the Islamic tradition. There's a question of whether or not everything that is so has to be so in virtue of a sonus. Whether, for example, everything that's majud has to be so by a wajud, right? Whether something that exists has to be so in virtue of an existence, something is true has to be so in virtue of a truth, something is beautiful has to be so in virtue of a beauty. And you can just deny it. And the so-called nominalist tradition mostly denies it. People who are hardcore realists accept it, and everybody else has to figure out what they want to make of it. Maybe that's just settling the question of what it... maybe that's a terminological determination. That's what counts as realism, is when you're prepared to accept that principle. Thank you. Thank you.
Calvin, as today is our last opportunity to talk to you, we would like to give you this book in which many of us wrote small articles.
Oh, so if I'd known about this, I would have given a very different talk, right? Much better informed, for starters. Thank you so much. And thank you.
Thank you for coming. E uma coisa que eu gostaria de avisar, ele tem anúncio ótimo para nos dar sobre a biblioteca dos agostinianos.
Está funcionando não. Então, terças e quartas-feiras, vocês podem visitar e consultar. Vocês sabem que online estão todos os artigos das revistas que nós temos lá. Podem consultar por título ou por uma palavra-chave que já vai dar tudo aquilo que vem. E depois você vai na biblioteca, se está aquilo que você busca, não precisa ir lá para buscar. Revistas e artigos de revistas. E depois também livros. Não é muito grande, mas o que nós temos, né, a gente oferece. A revista Study Agostinians, nós vamos também ter. Agora não temos, mas o padre Allan Fitzgerald, né, ele era o padre Botelho, mas agora é você mesmo. It's you. The manager, director, and study Agostinian.
Yeah.
The revista.
Editor.
You are the editor of the
Editor.
Yeah.
I'm no longer
Who is the
Jonathan Yates.
Oh,
io posso cantare. É só isso. Terças, quartas, às 8 da manhã, aliás, às 9 da manhã, às 4h35 da manhã.
Bom, gente, então muito obrigada por terem vindo. Nós nos encontramos amanhã novamente às 2h para a continuação do nosso curso em Ambrósio. Obrigada.